Okay, last week we talked all about old school parenting and the good in old school parenting, but today we're actually going to dive into the bad and the ugly of old school parenting. And let's jump in.
This is the Balanced Family Podcast with Ben
and Jessica. There's a lot to balance when you have a family: marriage, kids, health, career, while you're trying to balance all the opinions out there on how to do things right.
Today, we'll cut through the noise, tackle hard questions, and share stories as we try to get to the heart of the things that really matter.
So when we were coming in from lunch, Ben made a comment about my blazer, and he goes, "That's a sharp looking blazer." And I was just laughing because I'm like, that's such an old school parent kind of thing to say.
Do people not say sharp anymore?
It just was like, it's because it's business. You know, all like old school parents love like professional looks,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And so it was funny because it's a blazer and you use the word sharp.
Yeah.
That blazer looks sharp.
It's like that song by ZZ Top, Sharp Dressed Man. Like that's just, sharp is like a term. Another term I remember my dad used a lot was tough. And that's like, nobody says that anymore. Like, man, that's a tough truck.
I've never heard that before in my life.
Well, it's in the classic book, Outsiders.
Right. I know that, but that my parents
tough.
did not say that.
I think I say it sometimes. I feel like we need more of those words in this whole thing about old school. Like, let's bring some of these back.
Bring it back.
There's too many new words now.
Like Riz.
Yeah, I mean.
You should have said I got Riz.
Yeah, you got Riz. That's some sharp Riz right there, boy.
I don't know if that's like bad. I actually don't fully understand what Riz means, so I'm a little nervous.
We are like genuinely like out of the loop.
I know.
Yeah. Even though we talk to so many young people in our business, I'm just totally out of the loop. I read an article in New York Times the other day though about trend fatigue, and that a lot of Gen Z adults are just like. And not even Gen Z. Is there a Gen
Alpha.
Gen Alpha, yeah.
That's what our girls are, Gen Alpha.
Okay. So I guess it's more like Gen Z / Gen Alpha. Just trend fatigue. Like there's like, because they've grown up in social media and things are changing so fast, they are overwhelmed by trying to keep up with lingo. Like in this article, these young people are talking about how they don't even know what some of these words mean because the social media, this society changes so much faster. And they definitely can't keep up with styles, because they're changing. But this one guy was talking about in the interview about how there's a TikTok trend to show how not trendy you are in your house, like to show just how,
like normal,
basic, that would be the word we use, how basic you are. But then he talks about how like it's getting too trendy to show how not trendy you are.
So
and it's
funny.
Yeah. It's
so stressful.
Yeah, it is. It really is. But anyway, all that to say, we had a good discussion about just so much of just like the lost art of parenting. I would call last week's discussion of just like forgetting the importance of structure, boundaries, authority, discipline, and just like good old common sense.
Common sense.
I think we also talked about like work ethic and the emphasis on achievement and some of that stuff that is just can be really good and pragmatic and less focus on like our generation, which is just all about happiness, essentially. Like we want our kids to be happy. Mm-hmm. But this week we want to break down the bad, the ugly, like things that it's like good that our generation's kind of changing, honestly. And last week I kind of bashed the modern trend of like dads being like just having to play with their kids. Like it's expected that dads are just always playing with their kids. And we talked about how
entertaining your kids all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. But like, I think maybe that's a good place to even start though, is like gender roles. So even though it's kind of like crazy in our generation, not just dads, but like women, like we're expected to do so much that is just unreasonable. At the same time, when you look at the kind of more old school, if you will, generations in the past, like they were very rigid gender roles to the point where like it put a lot of strain on moms. And even if there wasn't, they didn't feel like there was strain. I look back at some of the things, it's kind of ridiculous that like men like did a lot of times did like absolutely nothing.
Like they would come home and like sit. I mean, that actually was real. Like they would just come home and sit. And
I just don't quite understand that. Like I understand conceptually, But like, I just, as a, like a loving husband, like I don't like to chill and relax and you're not able to chill. And that's why when we've kind of worked out.
Like, would you not feel any guilt?
Yeah.
Or like, golly, like,
yeah.
But I think it was this idea that like, he's had this really stressful work day. She has been home all day, presumably maybe with children or maybe without, for kids are in school. And so it was her job to care for the family.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that gender role, I mean, that was it.
Yeah.
But I think when we were kids, our parents and our moms like started working, and maybe not like literally our moms, but in general, like women really started going into the workforce, especially in the 80s and 90s. And so you have kind of this cultural shift where at that time the women were working and also still very much entrenched in those gender roles, which is probably why kids in our generation experience so much independence. Because like literally their moms like could not like take care of them. You know, it was like, hey, you need to go entertain yourself because I just got home from work and now I have to do all the laundry and clean the house and cook all the meals, you know? And now our generation is definitely trying to kind of flip that a little bit.
Yeah. And I want to say a preface, like both of our sets of parents,
we're not
awesome parents,
like that.
good marriages, like very like functional and not like we're kind of generalizing about just
I'm not talking about my family. I'm talking about in
the
general.
Traditional kind of man provides, woman takes care of a home. Like I think it's a good thing that our generation is just a lot more flexible with that. Even if the man is out of the house 9 to 5. And the reason I say that is like, I think as a man, when you experience taking care of children all day, like if you experience it for one day, you're like, dude, it is hard work. And then you can't really expect to come home, kick back and relax for, 3-4 hours and your wife does everything else. Like it's just kind of like crazy. And I just know like you and I, we evolved to this place where it became eventually a declared kind of the standard or value, but like, neither one of us sits down until we're done with everything. And what happens is like we knock out our chores, our evening chores like fast. And then we're both able to relax. But it's really weird. It would be weird for me to relax and you not to relax. Mm-hmm. And I understand there's some differences too if you have like a super physically demanding job as a man. But like being a mom is really demanding too.
And really physically demanding.
Yeah.
Well, and I think a lot in our generation, a lot of, I know like bedtime and bath time is a big dad role that I hear a lot of couples, dad takes over bath time and bedtime and then mom might come in to nurse or do whatever, but dad kind of takes over that whole time period, which I think is always it's a pretty good flow to have happen.
Well, and I wanted to transition about this whole thing about gender roles, like when you relate it to parenting, then not just like responsibility in the home. When you have a super rigid, in my opinion, when you have a super rigid view of like who's the disciplinarian and who's the nurturer, like that's kind of messed up. And the reality in parenting is that you both need to be nurturing and you both need to discipline. And the reason is, especially this goes for both sides of that. Like you don't want inconsistency. You don't want a child growing up in a bipolar home where it's like one parent is this way and one parent's that way. It's confusing for a child. And you want consistency in those boundaries. And that goes across just any kind of organization, what in the whole world, like consistency between humans is what determines the success of like anything, whether it's a sports team or a band, like whatever. So in a family unit, you can't have one person being the disciplinarian and the one person being the nurturer. And that's just kind of a messed up view. But traditionally in a lot of generations, it was seen a lot of times.
Wait till your daddy gets home.
Your daddy gets home. And I think there is like, there is a place sometimes of like, there's a different vibe about dad.
There's vibes for sure.
Yeah. But what I mean more about is like the burden of discipline has to fall on both parents, meaning they both have to know the boundaries and enforce those consistently versus one person being super easygoing, the other one not. That's a recipe for building.
And you and I, we actually, like just last week, like we might notice that the other person is parenting in a way that we're like, wait, what? Yeah. Why are you doing that? And instead of like me, let's say like Ben's parenting in a way that I don't agree with, like what would be horrible is for me to go behind his back and then start parenting in my way that I see fit. And then the kids are like, oh geez, like who do I listen to? And so what we do in those scenarios is usually I'll pull Ben aside and be like, hey, let's touch base about this. What's going on? Why are you doing X, Y, and Z? And we kind of try to get on the same page about that. And then we are consistent. And there's things that Ben prioritizes or cares about that maybe I don't care about as much. Like I think about like our dinner table rules. There's certain things that Ben cares about more that I just actually don't care about that much. But I've had to like get on the same page with him. And I think what you're describing is with old school parenting, there was a little bit more of a disconnect just simply because fathers in general just weren't as involved.
Exactly.
Typically.
Yeah.
There just wasn't really they weren't really seen as like having that role except for the just wait till your daddy gets home kind of thing, where then he would come in as the harsh disciplinarian, which we'll segue into, then only promotes this like kind of, I don't know, just warped view about authority
and fatherhood.
Do you want to talk more about that?
Well, I think we'll get to one thing I want to say about that was whenever we have these discussions, like sometimes it's like you feel like you're sounding judgmental, and it's like we're not being judgmental. Like, and back on the gender roles, like it's fine if you as a couple, if it's cool, the guy never changes a diaper and that's y'all's system, like whatever, like it's not a big deal. But when we're talking about parenting and like building culture and building values, it's not even saying that one way is right or wrong. It's the better way to look at it is like, how much more effective would your home be with two parents on the same page? How much more powerful and impacting will your values be if both parents like can articulate them and go and build them inside of the home? So it's not saying what works and what doesn't work. We're talking about excellence because we want to do things excellent. And I think people listen to this podcast really do as well.
Yeah.
So anyway, where were you going with?
I was just saying the authority, we talked about last week.
Yeah.
Some of the good was authority.
Yeah.
But I think where we could talk about the bad and then even the ugly is then where authority can kind of get skewed. And especially with like the father figure in the home.
Yeah. So like last week, I think I remember talking about like love and authority, and that the correct authority figure is one that's a loving authority. And love means you do something on someone else for someone else's benefit. You're always thinking about what's going to better that person, not make them happy or make them comfortable, but always make them better. And so that's your lens of authority. But the extreme view, the extreme tendency of authority is authoritarian, which is obey me because I am the authority. Well,
because I said so.
Because I said so. And that's kind of a phrase, you might hear and like, why do we have to do that? Because I said so. And, there are times there's
a time and a place.
There's a time as a parent, like, and this to me, what is nice to know about kids' development, like sometimes they can ask why, and it's in a different heart than other times. And the key is to build respect for authority and obedience, like when they're super young. When they get older and they have shown that they can obey and they honor you, they respect you. Like I love having discussions about why we do things because those are teaching moments. And all of discipline is about instruction. Discipline is not getting you to behave a certain way. No, it is also about instruction. And so you have to instruct a child, and therefore, just an arbitrarily, just like I'm the dictator, do what I say because I said so. It doesn't build anything. It's correct in that they should obey because you did say so and you're the authority figure. But you got to ask yourself, what am I building if I'm not then taking that next step inside of my role as an authority figure by giving my child instruction?
Yeah, I think one thing that we have done in our house with our kids is when they were little, especially, but even now, we will say to them, obey first, then ask questions, especially with stuff that, they just need to just do it. Mom, why do you want me to put my shoes in my closet, for example? Why are you even asking me that question? Just go obey first. Then you can come ask me why I wanted you to put your shoes in the closet, And those are like kind of little things that build that authority. But I think in the past with old school parenting, there was a lot of fear-based
Yeah.
consequences and fear-based like expectations of obedience of like, if you don't obey me, then fill in the blank. And it's like
everything's built off that.
Right. Everything's built off of these horrible fear-based consequences that you might get if you don't obey because I said so.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's not good. Like that only, like fear is not what you want to be building in your kids for obedience. They should want to obey you because they love you.
Yeah.
And they should want to obey you because they respect you.
Yeah.
Not because they fear you. And that I think is a really important distinction. The difference between fearing someone and respecting someone. And like you said earlier, respect really comes out of a place of love.
Yeah.
And also recognition of authority. So respect is a much better thing to aim for than, oh, I'm just going to fear you as my authority and, you know, I better obey, or man, like, you know, my life is, you know what I mean?
Well, that is a motivator when like super young kids, and it should be because their brains are less developed. They can't conceptualize like the massive role in their life that
I was
you
thinking
play.
more of older kids.
Yeah. But I think what you're getting at, Jessica, is just like that gradual change, like parenting, fear-based parenting, like we would characterize like old school parenting. It doesn't last. Like it eventually leads to rebellion. It eventually leads to resentment because it's just our brains aren't made for that. Like it's like that parenting book that we love so much, Shepherding a Child's Heart. It's like there's a curve of authority and influence. And like when your child's born, you have the most authority over their life. And if there's a gradual release of that authority into you're just a person of influence. And so as I always describe, like there's an interim period of respect. And the respect is like, the respect comes whenever you're okay. In a child's brain, it's like, okay, I know you're an authority figure and now you're instructing me. Wow, I feel so empowered to then go live life and understand why we do the things we do. Wow, I really respect that. And you know what? These values make sense. Like the reason we do these things makes sense. It may not be what I want on a selfish level, but it's like, I understand that now. Wow, it's like, thank you for giving me instruction. Like a kid's not articulated that way, but that's what's going on in their brains. And once that foundation of respect is then laid on top of that foundation of authority, then you're getting into the older ages where kids can then become more independent. And then they actually go to you for advice for themselves to go and become a teenager and a young adult and develop that independence. But the problem with like old school parenting is that it's all the fear, it's just all fear-based and it stays at that like base level, you know? And that's why it fails. It does fail in developing like whole humans that can go and live their lives.
Well,
people will struggle with fear and like all that and just all the baggage like their whole life.
And it produces like a lack of relationship in the home, you know, because if you fear someone, you're most certainly not going to be vulnerable with them.
Right.
You know, and I think that vulnerability, that's what we all want. When we're parenting teenagers, man, I want to be the mom that my teenagers want to open up to, you know, and that requires me to create an environment of vulnerability, an environment where they feel safe with me. And fear, you're not going to feel safe with a parent if you fear them. Yeah. You know, especially as you get older, you have to know that they love you and that they care for you and that, that respect. Yeah.
So let's talk about discipline. So last week when we talked about the good things about old school parenting, it was just the fact that like parents discipline, like period. Yeah. Because our generation is terrified of punishment, terrified of discipline, terrified of trauma. It's just like ridiculous. I mean, seriously, parents just don't parent anymore, it feels like. But with old school parenting, I would say there's an equally as damaging trend where discipline and punishment was A, way too harsh, or B, just absolutely unpredictable and chaotic. And this can apply to younger parents too, but basically like if your discipline is out of emotion only and it's reactive, you will not build good things in your kids, period. And I think that in the past, it was just kind of like accepted as just normal that like you might fly off the handle all the time and get angry at your kids. And that was just like normal. But we know that like discipline, if again, it goes back to like instruction, if there's no like intentionality behind it, like it does breed just really bad things and baggage inside of kids.
Yeah. And I think when you're in a parent-centric home, which is what we were talking about with old school parenting, then it's like, oh, the kids are just such a nuisance.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and so then you live kind of in this feeling of, and we're not talking about our personal parents. We're talking about just, we have a lot of interactions with people with all kinds of different parents and, you know, through teaching. And I think that when you grow up in a home like that, you feel constantly on edge, you know, because you just never know, you know, you're trying to be as invisible as possible, you know, to not have negative consequences. And again, that just fosters that sense of I'm not safe in my home. And I mean, I know that's the exact opposite of what every parent wants. Even if they're an old school parent, it's not that they're setting out to be like, yeah, I really want my kids to feel unsafe with me. That's never the heart that they have. But I think that when you are in a parent-centric world of, you know, my kids need to be seen and not heard. My kids need to be, you know, behave a certain way all the time. And I'm demanding this behavior that might be just kind of arbitrary. I'm not talking about like obedience. I'm talking about just like, you know, they got their ears scrubbed and they're standing at attention at the door whenever I walk in the door. I don't know. I don't know if anyone actually did that. Those are just like ideas in my mind. Examples of just kind of, like you're saying, kind of chaotic expectations that then when there are consequences, the consequences don't even make sense. They're just kind of like feel random, or the parent's just angry and just kind of flies off the handle. And they might be really angry one day about something, and then the next day let it slide because they're distracted. You know what I mean? There's not consistency. And I think that all of those things then again just create kind of this sense of just like unease in the kids.
Yeah. No strategy.
Right.
No system, like no philosophy. There has to be philosophy behind what you choose to do with that child. And as we know, like it's different for every kid. When you're talking about punishments and discipline and stuff like that, it's like we've gotten those places where it's like things weren't working. We had to strategize. And it's like a message is not getting through, or it was like, maybe we need to change our expectations. Mm-hmm. You know, it is like a cool thing that like parents these days do know honestly more about child development than a lot of generations past. And when you're armed with some of that knowledge of just like where a kid's brain is at 3 years old, like you can just understand what to do a little easier. And last week we talked about how it was like, it's pretty stupid how some people are just so anti-punishment, anti-discipline, anti-reward. At the same time, there's the other, you could fall into a trap of thinking punishment is the only answer to get them to obey. And it's like, you have to really discern, like, what am I trying to build? And maybe as a parent, like I've got to come up with a different expectation or strategy for this particular child for this particular season. Because, you know, and we talk a lot about biblical parenting, and like in biblical parenting, it's like, it's very clear, like God is patient. God is kind. God is not harsh. It's like, God's the boss. And, like fear the Lord. Yes. But at the same time, like God is a loving father. God is like the perfect father figure. And so you have to evaluate your home. Like if there's harshness, if there's this air of just like anger and just like frustration, like that is not godly. That's the reflection we have. So equal as we have to emphasize in our parenting of like, what are we building? What are the values? How are we putting boundaries around our kids? How are we teaching them authority? We have equal, if not more, conversations about like, dude, we need to chill out. We need to like take a deep breath.
We can be really intense.
Yeah, we are not exhibiting gentleness like we need to be. And it just seems as like in more old school parenting, like the harshness was like kind of norm and just like not a big deal. But that just breeds all sorts of bad stuff.
Yeah. I think one other thing too, just really quickly, is just kind of that emotional suppression of this, you know, especially I think with boys, maybe a little less with girls, but, you know, crying was seen as something that you shouldn't do, you know, and I think feelings, especially kids' feelings, weren't always acknowledged or validated. Yeah. It was kind of a sense of like, you got to pick yourself up, and don't cry, or don't show weakness, that kind of thing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I think that, I think a lot of people, especially in our generation now, are kind of trying to work through a little bit of feeling like they don't even really know how they feel, or they don't really even know what their emotions are because they were so used to shoving them back, which is ironic because typically the parents were being very emotional in that moment, right?
Yeah,
like
it
with
is ironic.
anger.
That's really interesting.
But but as a kid, then it's like if you're in that kind of home, you have to like suppress your emotions. And be like, okay, I gotta act the right way,
right?
Because if I don't act the right way, then there's gonna be this response. So I'm gonna like put on this face and I'm gonna be this certain way, even though inside I have actually a lot going on, a lot of emotions. And I think that lack of emotional validation, again, has unintended consequences.
Right.
I think again, it was so focused. It's so focused on behavior.
Yeah.
It's so focused
externals.
on externals with no real consideration of the heart, which again, talking about biblical parenting, it's like the Lord does not look at the outward appearance.
Right.
The Lord looks at the heart, and that's from when he was selecting the king and selected David, who was this like puny little guy in comparison to all of his brothers. And Samuel, realized that, I'm looking at the wrong thing. And God was very clear, like, I look at the heart. And so that is something that we have very much taken from and put into our parenting of like, we need to look at the heart. Now, of course, like we talked about, gentle parenting can kind of overdo that a little bit. There's a balance there, because you don't want to only then, deal with all the validation and stuff. So there is a balance, but
I feel like parents these days are just as focused on externals. Like
it's probably true.
I feel like they're so obsessed with the same problems that older generations were with, is like, how do I stop the tantrum? How do I get X outcome, X result? And that's what these experts try to bait parents with, like, here's the 10, do these 10 steps to stop that tantrum in its tracks. Is like, who cares about the tantrum? Like, let's look at the kid's heart.
Yeah, and if they're being rebellious, then that needs to be dealt with.
yeah, exactly. And exactly. And it's like, you don't want to nurture rebellion.
Right.
Like, but at the same time, you can't be harsh. So like, it really comes down to balance. And like we've talked about, is shepherding the heart of the child. That implies there's instruction, there's guiding. A shepherd is like this caretaker that is a protector, but also understands he's dealing with sheep and not a giant bull. He doesn't shepherd the sheep like they're bulls. You know what I'm saying? There's gentleness. But at the same time, he's the shepherd. Like, he decides where things go. But our generation they still want they still want good behavior. They want their cake and to eat it too.
And they believe that validating the feelings is, and taking care of the kids' intrinsic needs is what's going to produce that good behavior.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, if the pitfall of the old school was like, I want my kids to behave well, so I'm going to be this dictator.
Yeah, make them
that's a harsh dictator and control. And then you got this other pendulum. I want my kids to be perfect, so I'm just going to make them feel good all the time. And neither has balance inside of all that.
Yeah.
You saying that also makes me think of that phrase, "Stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about."
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That's kind of weird to think about.
That is really like, when you actually take a step back, you're like, wait, what does that even mean?
But I know what it feels like when a kid is like, won't stop crying. Like, it is kind of like, it can rattle you.
Yeah, especially if they're really loud criers.
Yeah. So it's like, I can kind of get that, even though that's weird and kind of messed up to think about.
It is.
But anyway, I want to briefly mention about spanking.
Ooh,
I said it.
Oh my gosh.
Said it. Because a lot of our generation, like when they think, the first thing they think of with old school parenting is spanking. I just want to say we're not going to go super deep into that, because I am working on an epic series later this year, or whenever it's going to come out, called "Is Spanking Abuse?" which is
the question.
That is the question that, in our generation, it's portrayed as like the word. It's almost like, as long as you don't spank your kid, you're a good parent.
Which is funny.
That's what's communicated.
Right.
And so be on the lookout for that. It's going to blow your mind.
I already have so much to say, but I'm going to hold it back.
Yeah. But also, in the context of old school parenting, I would agree with a lot of voices that like absolutely arbitrarily angry, intense, just spanking for everything with no thought, no consideration, no strategy.
No repair.
No repair.
Yeah.
Like, and not even in this like healthy, loving relationship with the parent, that does not produce good things. And, so anyway, and I'm not
more
saying
on that.
yeah, more on that later, but anyway, it could
it
gets pretty messy for sure. And I would just say, that to me is not just the practice itself. It's attached to this kind of like you talked about, just like the dominance of the parents' emotions, right? It's like the parents are actually the ones out of control, and more like old school parenting versus just the kids. And there's all these, fancy terms nowadays about like co-regulation, all that kind of stuff of like, you have to be calm if you expect your kids to be calm. And that's good stuff.
Yeah, it's true.
It's true. How do you expect your kids to be self-controlled if you're not self-controlled? And so I feel like, even though we've talked so much about the pressures of modern parenthood that are kind of crazy, at least there is a lot of introspection about that particular issue.
Yeah, and about dealing with your own issues so that you can be more just correct and emotionally available for your kids and et cetera. And yeah, I mean, I saw a post the other day that was a little bit annoying to me, but it was interesting. The thought was like, it's so hard because we're having to parent ourselves while we're parenting our kids, essentially.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like parts of it were a little just like, I don't know, some of that stuff is just annoying to me. But I think it is true in that what I think they're saying is, parenthood is work. You actually do have to change.
Yeah.
You yourself have to transform. And so I think that, maybe to wrap this up, with old school parenting, it was all focused on, I'm going to get my kids to behave correctly.
Yeah.
And really what we're saying is, well, actually the buck stops here.
Yeah.
And I need to transform. I need to change. I need to become more patient, more kind, more gentle, more aware, more intentional, more, because some people can be kind of unaware and not really good parents in that way.
One. That's a big one.
Or too intense as well, and too micromanaging. Thank you. I was like, what's that word? So I think, again, as always, we love balance. There's truth and nuggets in everything that we talk about. I think a lot of times social media wants you to believe that it's like everything is bad except for this one thing, or everything is bad on that other side and except for this one thing. And the truth is almost always in the middle. And there's almost always nuggets of truth in everything that you can pull from to be able to really be a good parent.
Man, that's what it's all about, is finding the principles inside of what people say about different parenting.
Yeah.
And not getting on some bandwagon or just believing everything at face value. And the whole thing about awareness, though, that's something we didn't even have in our outline. That's a really good point. I would say like awareness is huge, and that maybe in old school parenting or whatever, there would be a lot, maybe too much
hyper awareness.
Right? I would say like more too hands off and not aware of what maybe like what a kid is going through.
Oh, I was meaning awareness of kids' behavior. I actually
there's kind of both of that. Maybe there's maybe it's too much awareness about certain things.
Awareness of behaviors, not awareness of heart.
The heart, yeah. But I would say even, I think last week we were talking about like independence and how it was good that kids were more independent, and that parents are expected to do too much. But actually there can be a danger in like not having a clue what's going on with your kids. And so there is a balance of just like even being aware of your kids and tracking them and being that shepherd, to guide them on the, in their journey. And then another thing you said, Jess, about like emotions, and we always gripe that parents these days are like way hyper focused on emotions. I would say in old school parenting, like I've heard stories like weird stuff. Like my father never told me that he loved me ever, but he didn't have to. Stuff like that. Of this, like that was like this mentality is just like you don't say you love him, and I'm just like, that's kind of weird.
It is weird.
Maybe we don't need to dote. Maybe we don't need to just like smother our kids
constantly praise them. And,
absolutely right, absolutely. But I'm like, words are kind of important. Like words shape the home. Words shape a kid's identity and their self-concept. And so that's something that's kind of interesting, is that I don't really know what that came from back in the day. Yeah, but I'm thankful like nowadays it's kind of normal to like tell your kid you love them. So anyway, that you had a good comment about balance. Is like, that's what it all comes back to. If you're listening to this and if you're kind of like Jessica and I, like you're passionate and you assess, you're like, man, there's just a lot of harshness. There's a lot of emotion. Like get serious about gentleness, about compassion, about patience, like assessing that development inside of yourself and like be that stable force of love and compassion inside of your home. But if you've listened to this series and you've kind of drank the Kool-Aid of gentle parenting in our modern generation that is just so scared of authority, scared of structure, scared of anything that might make a kid feel uncomfortable, it's like, go talk to your spouse about what do you want to build inside of your home? What do you envision? What's going to be the things that the seeds you're putting in the ground now, like what's that going to produce 10 years from now? Mm-hmm. Because it produces something, and it's not something you got to beat yourself up about, but parenting is a journey. It's a migration. It's a growth process, and just be intentional and enjoy the journey and enjoy the fact you're not going to be perfect.
I think one last little comment I'll make is I think it's really important if you do get a lot of your parenting information from social media, I think it's really important to actually follow lots of different accounts. Yeah. So I love doing this. You might think I'm like bipolar or something, because I'll follow like all the crunchy accounts, and then I'll follow all of the like PhD medical accounts. Like I follow them all. Yeah. And I do that with parenting as well. So I follow a lot of the gentle parenting accounts, and I also follow a lot of the non-gentle parenting accounts. And I think it's important to do that because, again, it helps you be able to kind of learn. A lot of times when you're only just one-sided about a particular type of parenting, it can just make you one-sided in your parenting and not actually be able to express the correct things, and to really be able to consider other perspectives, or maybe to realize like, oh, I didn't realize that about this style of parenting that I'm really into. I didn't realize that it might produce kids when they're teenagers who have, who are rebellious or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. Kind of gives you like a different perspective that I think then, like we're talking about, you can take nuggets of truth from each one, and you can actually start making your parenting, instead of just kind of one stream, it's like multi-streamed parenting that really is just better. Yeah.
And another thing that's interesting is how different spouses can be in just their personality and stuff like that. We talked earlier about just like consistency, but it's a process to try to parent more consistently, because we're like, you and I are different people, mm-hmm. And we've learned to like appreciate certain things that the other person does really well in parenting, and not be like, oh, well, that's your thing. But actually like, yeah, you're here to enrich me and make me a better parent, and vice versa. And that's why like parenting as a team is just beautiful. So talk with your spouse, have intentional conversations, think about the type of kids you want your kids to be, the type of adults that they're going to be someday. Talk about the values, the things that's really important to you as a family. And then go think of some practical ways to go build that in your home.
See you next time.
See you guys.
Thank you so much for listening today. It would mean so much to us if you left a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you heard this.
And let us know your thoughts on today's episode by leaving a comment on Spotify or YouTube, where you can also watch these episodes.